Okay, and continuing healthcare topic, I would like to welcome Justin Lane from AnyLogic with his presentation for flattering the emotional curve with new AI systems, computer simulation as a tool for policymakers and stakeholders in times of crisis. So, hello, Justin.
Hello, hello. Thank you. I'm happy to be here with everyone today. There's been a lot of really interesting presentations, so hopefully I will live up to the bar that's been set. The presentation that I have today is unique in some ways. I mean, a lot of people here I've noticed are doing really interesting work in simulation, particularly in policy relevant topics, which is really exciting to see. One of the things that we are trying to do that's a bit unique is bring in a lot of data that's otherwise considered qualitative data and integrating it in quantitative ways. So this involves using a really interesting data pipeline that we've employed on this project and a few others. And I'm going to share a little bit about how we built that and why we built it the way we did, and how it is that we integrated this with an AnyLogic simulation that can help policymakers, particularly in Norway, to better understand the spread of misinformation and emotional contagion during the COVID-19 pandemic. Effectively, we'll go through a bit of the background, a very brief thing on the idea of why we're taking this approach to COVID modeling a little differently than other people are, some of the problems of model validation, and then how we're using an interesting social listening pipeline effectively, and connecting it with AnyLogic so that we can create automated model initialization, and then a little bit, if we have time, of course, to discuss where we're going with this in the future, because we think that there's a couple of interesting applications for this that could be really policy relevant, but also very timely for at the moment. The project was started by myself and my research partner, Professor Laurent Schultz, at the University of Agder. We basically responded to an open call by the Norwegian government when the COVID pandemic started. They were very eager to try and look for innovative solutions that can try and help them get any kind of an edge, to better understand how to respond in an unprecedented event. Nobody had seen, no one really had a baseline of what to do, for basically 100 years. So we came forward and said, we're not epidemiologists, but they needed to track emotion and misinformation on social networks. Particularly, they were interested in Twitter, and Twitter, of course, was very interested in opening up data pipelines to researchers so that we could get more data and better understand how that was going in time. So that was also a really interesting collaboration. We proposed to them that instead of using a usual model, we wanted to use a multi-agent AI model. Effectively, just for the sake of definitions, that is an agent-based model where the mechanisms inside of each agent are specifically programmed to try and be as psychologically realistic as possible or as required for the actual application. Then validation was something that we decided to kind of put our hats on in the social sciences and look at using nationally representative surveys in order to get data on the ground from different individuals and different groups, but also try and go the in silico route, if you will, and get validated data through social media. So, as a lot of us know, most of the COVID-19 models that we currently have been using and were available at the beginning of the pandemic were reappropriated SEER models. They were just looking at susceptibility in infected and recovered individuals and different variations on that theme, right? Now, our specialty obviously was not epidemiology. We are both social scientists with backgrounds in AI and psychology. And so we wanted to look at this from a more human standpoint and look at it from the level of human sociality. So our model focused more on the spread of emotional contagion and how this affects humans. And we really wanted to get at these three questions for the stakeholders is who's going to follow regulations that are output from the stakeholders? When is misinformation more engaging, to try and see if we can mimic those patterns to try and get an edge on, basically an information overload that is social media today, and what effects do anxiety have on the political leanings and identities of different individuals, and how that might subsequently be affecting misinformation and people who are and the motivation to follow regulations. Now, Our approach, we take a lot of data from different places, right? So we do have simulation validation, but that's built on top of a foundation of survey results and social media analytics. So we want to try and look at three key inputs and outputs, and those are behavioral, psychological, and digital. For behavioral data, we were relying on survey data, a lot of things that are self-report, just because when you're in the middle of a pandemic with an international team, you can't very well fly, much less actually do any sort of observation of people as they are in the world. For psychological data, we combined the survey with digital data, and we're able to kind of connect the survey data with social media data by creating psychological profiles from the social media data. So the surveys, which are using psychometrically validated measures, have like the other side of the puzzle piece from what we're doing with social media analytics. And that can help to create a nice sort of close hug between all three of these different bodies of literature and the different mechanisms and approaches and data types that we were putting into this model. So the validation that we have for behavioral, the behavioral data itself, we worked with Kantar, which is the same as Gallup, but it's their local offices for Kantar there, and we deployed this nationally representative survey over 2 waves. That allows us to not just look at the snapshot, but look at the changes over time, so we can try and control and put in the dynamics that are going to be interesting from the agent-based modeling perspective. The measures, of course, we wanted to look at sociological measures and psychological measures. We also wanted to include political measures, just because by the time we did the first wave of the survey, which was last summer, there was already very political undertones in both Europe and North America regarding how the pandemic was being handled and who was going to be doing what in response to certain policies. So we wanted to at least incorporate that angle to create a more valid and more interesting model. Now, one of the things that we did find was that when we were asking about belief questions of what kind of misinformation people were interested in, there were 2 very clear clusters of information, and this was very interesting for us to incorporate into the agent-based model from the beginning, which is that the sort of circular information that we see here in this cluster, which just clustered the answers on questions we had about misinformation and disinformation regarding the pandemic and COVID. You see one circular glob of information, which are largely people who do not endorse any conspiracy theories whatsoever. And then you see kind of a mosh of people who endorse at least one of the conspiracy theories or one of the bits of misinformation about the pandemic. But there's not a very cohesive ideology that we were able to pull out from our analytics. And when we look between time 1 and time 2, what we see is that there's actually a slight tightening. People started to come around and meet in the middle between their beliefs. So it's not that people from the conspiracy side to the non-conspiracy side got further apart as the pandemic went on. They actually got closer. I think a lot of the conspiracies really got so far-fetched that people stopped believing them, and then some of the things that were considered conspiracy and misinformation early on started to feel more real for a lot of people. And so that we used to try and better parameterize the behavioral aspects of our simulation on how an individual will act or react to a policy, and also how they've been affected by some kind of policy. And that's one of the reasons that we had this link between this and the social media data. But using the survey data, we wanted to create an architecture that helps us to pick apart all of the different things that are going on in the model. So from the survey, we also were asking all of these different questions. We created a structural equation model to be the backbone of our architecture at the agent-based level. We found that different perceived threats have very different connections to political leanings, which had different connections to whether or not someone would actually follow the beliefs or follow the restrictions in Norway, which are called dugnad in Norwegian. It basically means kind of like the communal responsibility to do what's needed to get through the pandemic. What we found effectively was that contagion, financial, and natural threats had an effect where it was increasing more conservative political leanings, while social and predatory threats, like the idea that someone might kill you, was increasing more left-leaning political leanings, and that those political leanings did have effects on whether or not you would follow the rules that were set out by the local governments or not. But that was completely mediated by how you identified as a Norwegian, right? So national identity was playing this interactive effect between politics and the dugnad and the restrictions. It was not just a one-to-one thing. So in our model, we utilize semantic networks to represent personal and social schemas and personal and social identities. So we're able to actually reconstruct slight differences in the identities to try and capture this. So that's one of the reasons really that we chose AnyLogic, for example, over other software modeling platforms, was the ease and ability with which we can do multi-paradigm modeling. So adding things like system dynamics over time in with the agent-based models at the same time, and adding the complexities of network matrices into an agent architecture at the agent level, and then have them calculated and better understood and manipulated using functions at that higher level, actually became really useful for us as from an efficiencies standpoint, where you're in a race against the clock to try and create a viable model that might be able to help a policymaker, before the crisis is over. Um, this links us directly to the digital data that we collected as well. As I mentioned, we were gathering data from Twitter, which gives us an automatic social network. The Twitter API provides you with the links of followers and friends of any user. So that provides us a ready-made social network, and you see a network visualization there. That is one of the actual networks that we've visualized in the model itself. This is visualized using Gephi. We don't actually do the full network visualization within our AnyLogic simulation, just because it's not something that's very useful for the stakeholders. We also import psychographic maps of those users. So analyzing the text of their social media feeds, we can get information about their personality, their concerns, their fears, the sort of threats that go into their political leanings, etc. And we're doing that with something called the CulturePulse API, which is an AI-backed text API where you can put in a unstructured text and you can get back basically a profile of what those texts look like. By gathering that information directly, we were able to initialize this using a database of those users, their social network links, and the psychographic maps, and that gives us a very quick pipeline to a very realistic and psychometrically validated initialization for the model. What we revealed through that actually is that there are very large influencers outside of Norway, particularly coming from the Middle East, and that the clusters of information are far more related to language than actual beliefs or misinformation. So it's not just that there's an echo chamber of information around COVID, at least not when it comes to Scandinavia. The biggest influence actually is an echo chamber of language, which is somewhat to be expected. But with Google Chrome having a right click where you can translate any tweet, for example, and automatic translation being a key aspect of just about all social network platforms today, it becomes something that's very easy to overcome, right? That language barrier allows you to break in. And for example, we found that one of the key influencers in the network in Scandinavia had a very high betweenness with the cluster from Turkey. So we were seeing issues and anxieties related to the geopolitical situations in the Middle East, having a very large influence on the perception and anxiety of individuals in Norway. And so that's something that we're still testing out and still trying to better understand as we continue to develop this model out. Now, the pipeline itself that we used has a lot of different categories. Like I said, it allows us to take any raw unstructured text and return these approximated parameters. It was developed over several years of lab research, so it's not just a machine learning pipeline. There's a lot of experimental work that goes into it. It is using both a lexical and a statistical or machine learning approach. It's currently functional in all of the languages that we were using, with the exception of one, but there were, I think, 3 tweets in that language, so we didn't have to worry about that. A much larger issue actually is that the linguistic tagging in the Twitter API for things like tweets that just have emojis are not defined linguistically. So the CulturePulse system does take into account emoticons and has them coded as well. So that's something that was useful and helped us to decide how we would use that and how we would deploy it. And this is something that you can liken it to sentiment analysis in many ways. A lot of people do, but it also includes things like anxiety and morality, the extent to which people are talking about finances or family and friends. And that was one of the other things that we needed, right? We wanted to know not just whether or not they were happy or sad. It's a pandemic, so there shouldn't be a lot of positive sentiment. We don't assume so. And indeed, that's also not what we found, too. So we created a pipeline that largely just looks like this. Where data is being scraped and coming in. It's hitting that API, and we're just aggregating that data at the user level so that we can create averages, and then importing that data into AnyLogic from a JSON file. So we didn't use the standard database import functions that we usually would use from SQL or from a CSV file. We wrote our own custom functions to bring that in from a MongoDB system. And then initialized each agent kind of one at a time based on the arrays that we pulled in from the JSON. Doing that significantly sped up the model initialization and validation. Now, naturally, bringing in that much data into a data pipeline does slow down the initialization pretty substantially. But having to do it only once and know that your model validation is largely outsourced into other technology that's been well researched and has, scientific peer-reviewed publications backing it up, allowed us to kind of focus more on the behavioral functions of the simulation itself and how we can present these results to stakeholders than trying to get bogged down in the often months and months long process of actual, of validating some of the initial assumptions. We kind of just exported those assumptions using this system. And this is something we've done before and something we look to do again in the future. So the big drawback, the big benefit for this for us was actually, connecting this pipeline into AnyLogic, having the simulation engine already taken care of by AnyLogic, having the state charts from some of the models in AnyLogic, but also bringing over the data analytics from CulturePulse and creating a single pipeline for creating a psychologically realistic multi-agent AI model. So the initial results that I can share for now, the main takeaway is that the geographic regions have their own cultural signatures. So what is catchy and what is correlated with misinformation in Scandinavia is different than what's outside of Scandinavia. So group 1 here is outside of Scandinavia, group 2 here is inside of Scandinavia in these regressions. And basically what you're seeing is that both in the real world, we're seeing that certain cognitive properties like readability are significant in engagement. So for example, the more readable that something is outside of Scandinavia, the more engagement it has. But that's the opposite inside of Scandinavia. And that's one of the things that's interesting is that if you look through here, a lot of these coefficients are statistically significant, right? So things like morality, right? In-group morality or purity morality or even morality in general, those are all significant. But in some cases, the signs are flipped, right? So moral, right? Harm and care, like how much you're willing to harm someone or how much you want to stop the harm of someone else, that has an inverse effect. It's still significant in both geopolitical locations, but in one area, it's going to have a higher rate of correlation with misinformation. The other is going to have a lower. So there's no global way to combat misinformation here. It has to be culturally attuned. The same goes for engagement as well. So using language about somebody's body, for example, is extremely useful in one area, but not in another. Talking about female gender norms is, useful in one and not in another. And then male is useful in the opposite, right? So taking a one-size-fits-all approach or trying to export information from the Middle East or from North America and then applying it to Scandinavia not only might not have valid effects, it might have the opposite effects that are intended for policymakers when it comes to public engagement and getting the message out. So from future research and applications, one of the things that we want to do is go back to some of the original research that was utilizing and developing this pipeline, which had to do with understanding extremism and the use of AI for predicting religious violence. We also want to start looking more broadly at political violence. A lot of the work that we're seeing with our collaborators is showing that this is something that's extremely useful and very viable. We're working with a new social media company, Minds.com, to try and utilize some of our results to better understand and possibly even reverse the radicalization that happens in online social media networks. Now, one of the ways that we're doing this with Minds is they have a commitment, and and our scope and our engagement with them, aligns with this commitment to not censor information, even misinformation. And so what we have to do, the challenge there is to say we can't be like a Facebook, right? We can't just kick these people off the platform. We have to find a way to de-radicalize them and address the very real issue of radicalization and extremism online, but do it without kicking them off the platform, which doesn't even address the platform. It just kicks it under the rug or puts it in somebody else's rug. So naturally, though, that in that area, dealing with misinformation is not the hardest issue. There is a question that I'll jump right into, though, because it's related here, is how do we judge misinformation? Were there specific ideas or statements that were characterized as misinformation? In this, what we did is we went out and we got a corpus of tweets. So we went out to Twitter and we got a bunch of tweets, some of which were misinformation, some of which weren't, and some of which appeared to be it. And we did train a machine learning system there, and we're using that to judge, the extent to which there was misinformation content in those tweets. And so that was the way that we went about doing that, was by creating a new ML platform there. And we collaborated with some professors and students and some data sources at the University of Agder, where my collaborator is based. So in the future, we're really excited to look at this and try and widen this out and not just do COVID-related responses, but try and see if we can use this to better understand and basically not necessarily predict when and where political violence might come out, but when and where we can implement new policies to try and lessen the threat of political violence. I think that taking that more nuanced approach really lends itself well to agent-based modeling in particular, and the kinds of predictions that we can make in agent-based modeling, using that with the epistemological scare quotes of a quasi-academic, I guess. But I think that is really the next step here. And one of the things that I'll just wrap up with as a takeaway is that one of the things that we learned is that a lot of these numbers are useless when it comes to the policymakers. They don't care. They don't care about what we did with the model. They don't care how cool it is. They don't care how advanced this is. What they want to know is the story. How can we use it, right? And so my biggest takeaway is that the challenge, I think, for a lot of us in the modeling and simulation and AI world is how do we take this really advanced and really amazing tool for policy analysis and for understanding social systems and make it understandable for people who do not have the same backgrounds that we do? How can we make it digestible for people who really want to just see in one slide, this is what you found and this is what you think I should do, so that they can make a viable decision where they have a lot of riding on it politically. So that's kind of where I will leave it. The last question, I guess if I can jump right into the questions, has to do with can we consider the Twitter usage as representative of a demographic population? How do you include passive users or non-users? So the answer to the first question, can we consider Twitter usage analytics representative of a demographic population? In this case, because our target population is all of Norway, the answer to that is no, we can't. That's one of the reasons that we did a nationally representative survey, was because we knew going into this what the Twitter sphere looks like in Scandinavia. They are Facebook preferred, if you will. They don't use a lot with Reddit, which is really the community group online that I think has some of the best data to look at and use. So we knew that Twitter was not going to be representative, but we also could judge that. And in the survey, we asked them how often they're using the different social media platforms, so that we can better judge how we need to adjust our estimates based on the nationally representative data that we did collect with Kantar. So in that, we're approximating the data based on the passive users or non-users as best as we can from the survey. And that's one of the reasons that was such a critical link for us to make. So yeah, I'm happy to answer any other questions. There we go, we have Daria coming back. So
Thank you, Justin.
Yeah.
Thank you for your answers and thank you for your questions, the participants. So I just would like to remind you again that if you have any more questions after the session, you can contact Justin directly to the direct messages through his profile at the conference platform. So feel free to use this opportunity. And I would like to tell that our live stream here it ends now, and I would like to invite you to another live stream that starts right now, just in 4 minutes, with a presentation of Decision Lab, and they will showcase the presentation about the reinforcement learning. So we'll be happy to see you there. So check the agenda, move to another live stream, and continue joining our presentations and learn more simulation modeling insights and presentations. Thank you very much, Justin, once
Thank you.
again. Yeah, thank you.